Takehana, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this great conference. And also thank you for organizing this conference. My name is Yosuke Takehana from Fukuoka University. I'm sorry to say that my title has changed. Masakazu Nakai's Technology as Mediation. In the first place, my title was I forgot. Optimism of knowledge. Yeah, as a result of my considerations, I has changed my title. So this paper is too long. While skipping some paragraphs, I read these sentences. Introduction. Two key concepts that characterize the Kyoto School discourse on technology are poiesis and Marxism. Among the principal figures involved in those discussions were Nishida Kitaro and Miki Kiyoshi and Tosaka Jun. These three philosophers are known for having articulated philosophical approaches to technology in pre-war Japan. Nakai Masakazu Nakai, who developed an original aesthetic theory under the influence of the intellectual environment at Kyoto Imperial University, also addressed the philosophical significance of technology. This presentation attempts to understand the character of Nakai's philosophy of technology by examining its relationship to the Kyoto School's contemporaneous discourse on the topics. Also, Nakai's innovative work, particularly exemplified by the logic of the committee, has been highly praised by figures such as Kuno Osamu and Tsurumi Shunsuke. It has not attracted significant attention in the field of Kyoto School studies. For scholars who have focused primarily on Nishida, Nakai's line of thought may have appeared somewhat distant. Furthermore, Nakai himself seems to have maintained a critical stance toward Nishida's philosophy. Nevertheless, Nakai's concept of mediation, a central notion in his philosophy, I think, can be loosely interpreted having been influenced by Tanabe Hajime. His writing also contains numerous passages that appear to consciously engaging with the thought of Kuki Shuzo. Tsurumi Shunsuke interpreted Nakai's ideas, particularly those found in the logic of committee, as a theory of communication. And this helped frame Nakai's work within the context of communication theory and media theory. Although I do not claim comprehensive familiarity with this or research in this domain, I would suggest that some of the key debates, such as whether Nakai's concept of mediation corresponds more closely to the notion of, in German, medium or Mittel, cannot be properly understood without reference to the philosophical debates on mediation and the mediation of nothingness between Nishida and Tanabe. Similarly, Nakai's treatment of the concept of moment and eternity may be most accurately interpreted in the light of Kyoto School's thought in the 1930s, particularly on that of Kuki Shuzo. Skip this paragraph. And this paragraph, in this chapter, I will show that the philosophy of technology of the Kyoto School is fundamentally understood as poiesis. That's all. And it is well known a fact. So I skip all sentence of this chapter and skip to next chapter. Chapter 2, Kant's technique of nature of the problem of aesthetic disinterest. Having briefly surveyed, this spot, it should first be noted that Nakai's interest in technology predates in the 1930s when Kyoto School philosophers began to address the topic directly. Moreover, his engagement with technology was not initially shaped by discourses of production of Marxism. Nakai, who studied aesthetics under Fukada Yasuke at Kyoto Imperial University, wrote his graduation thesis in June 1925 on Kant's critique of judgment. Nakai's first academic publication in Tetsugaku Kenkyu, the Journal of the Kyoto Philosophical Society, to which he would later contribute additional assistance, was also devoted to Kant's critique of judgment. The essay titles on Kant's first draft of the preface on the third critique appeared in July 1927. In this essay, Nakai focuses the Kant's first introduction of the critique of judgment, a text originally intended as a preface, but later discarded by Kant for being too lengthy. The version known to readers until then was abridged version edited by Kant students Beck. In 20th century, the full original manuscript was included in the Kassler edition of Kant's collected works and was published independently as one book series of Pehabe. Nakai examined the differences between Beck version and newly available full manuscript, as well as divergences between the first and second introduction. What Nakai emphasized in this essay was that the Beck version omits key passages on technique and the technique of nature, thereby causing the concept of technique to lose systematic function as a mediating category between theoretical and practical realms. For Kant, technique of nature does not refer to the objective mathematical structure of nature, but rather to its being subjectively purposive, as judged by reflective judgment. Though the implication of this for the systematic unity of Kant's three critics exceed the present discussion beyond my ability, the idea that technology mediates between theory and practice would become a recurring theme in Nakai's later philosophy. Conventionally, technique and technology was distinguished in modern terminology. The former often refers to bodily skills of artisanal practices, while the latter indicates a society organized manipulation of nature based on scientific knowledge. One of the hallmarks of the Kyoto School's philosophy of technology is its effort to treat both aspects as continuous under the perspective of productive action involving using tools. Even in Tosaka's Marquez framework, where only the latter counts as true technology, the subjective side is acknowledged as significant. In this early Kant studies, Nakai seems to have remained within the Homer understanding. However, as his thought developed in the 1930s, his concept of technology broadened to include the latter. A decisive influence in this development was Ernst Cassirer, A Substance and Function. Nakai elaborates on this, his essay, 機能概念の美学への寄与. In general, philosophy of Kyoto School shared a common orientation toward dismantling the traditional concept of substance and the logic grounded in it that characterized Western philosophy. For Nishida, it was praise. For Tanabe, it was a mediation that serves as a basis for overcoming Western modes of thought and logic. In Nakai's case, that foundation was function. Nakai frequently used examples such as windows or warships to explain the inadequacy of the concept of substance in grasping reality. According to traditional thinking, the concept of a window is formed by extracting common properties from countless individual windows. However, while such repeated abstraction increases the conceptual universality, it ultimately leads to the conclusion that concept bears no actual correspondence to real windows, namely that it is that vague general representation which is called a window. In contrast, a window, understood through the concept of function, is a structured composite of three elements: lighting, ventilation, and visibility. Depending on the relative weight of each these elements, various types of windows are produced. Furthermore, Nakai notes that because this way of thinking does not rely on mental images formed in memory, one avoids the paradox produced by substance and representation-based thinking that people in Meiji era, confronted with modern worship vastly different from those of their time, would be unable to derive the concept of worship from their mental image. What is essential to the concept of function is how each individual element performs its role in relation to the whole. Interpreting Nakai's intent, we might say that even if a window pane is broken, as long as it continues to fulfill its irreplaceable function for lighting, the replaced pane and or even the entire window should still be regarded as same thing. In functional logic, equivalence does not mean quantitative identity, but rather positional equivalence, that is, a relational correspondence of one element in a set to another element in another set. Applying this idea to aesthetics, Nakai derived a new perspective on technology. As both function, I skip this paragraph. I move to this paragraph. What is critically important in understanding this point is the fact Nakai draws a distinction between taking means toward an end and feeding the end itself. According to Nakai, when an element is functioning well within some kind of overall order, it can be considered as being truly deeply disinterested. That is, it carries the meaning of an aesthetic attitude as a disinterested interest, in sense that it is liberated from the dimension of concern that demands the fulfillment of an end. Nakai put it in this way, quote, "Here arises a different way of viewing the idea of purpose, that is, a way of seeing through the purpose as a great order, a profound complex that includes even the desire itself as one of its internal elements. Having cast off the psychological view that regards purpose merely as desire, and as instances in which one is fitting well into such an total order, Nakai envisions the following two cases, namely internal technology and external technology. The former refers to that which is related to the technology of bodily composition, such as breath, iki, and kotsu in artistic creation and performance. While the latter refers to that which is related to the technology of social composition, such as collective structural beauty or beauty of character. Thus emerges the foundational framework of Nakai's aesthetics, one that is inseparable from the very concept of technology. Three, the development of technical beauty. This model aesthetic sensibility grounded in the concept of function is developed by Nakai as what he calls technical beauty, gijutsubi. Such an idea is addressed, particularly with attention to the body, in the latter half of his essay, the contribution, blah, blah. Here, Nakai invokes Kant's notion of the technique of nature and argues that the meaning of nature in this context should be expanded to include human bodily constitution. In other words, inner nature. He continues as follows. This gives us reason to think that Kant, on his overly Protestant fashion, had cast aside the organic sense too far, and that there might have been room for lawful reconsideration of it. For the muscle, by evaluating its own activity through the nerves within it and grasping through direct reflection, the deep lawful regularity it finds there, that is where we should locate a truly pure intuition of the technique of nature. In all arts, in what is called technique or skill, the internal structure of the art must always be grounded in the deep trust in this inner technique of nature, namely refinement of muscular operation. Here we find a different interpretation of technique of nature from that which Miki would later discuss in the logic of imagination when he introduced the idea of historical nature, 歴史的性. And it is upon this very basis, the refinements, the muscular operation that give rise to technical beauty, that Nakai would develop his original project of exploring the philosophical or aesthetic meaning of sports. As someone who dearly loved rowing, Nakai regarded the purest form of technical beauty as existing in the world of sports. In his 1931 essay, 芸術の人間学的考察, Nakai offers a clearer definition of this notion. According to him, natural beauty and artistic beauty correspond to direction. Slowness, Geborgenheit, and projection, Entworfen. Technical beauty, by contrast, arises in the interactive middle ground between those two directions. In other words, technical beauty emerges in the convergence of sensing and doing, in hearing and singing, in listening and speaking. These three types of beauty do not exist in isolation. In practice, human beings always live within in between. Seeing is simultaneously drawing, listening is also speaking inwardly. For Nakai, aesthetic experience in the domain of technique represents the very space in which human beings immerse themselves in the reality of art. Hence his claim. He claimed it is in the domain of technical beauty that human beings, in the purest sense, immerse themselves in art within themselves. Here, Nakai also articulates a core dimension of his theory of technology. For him, technology is not merely the act of producing objects through tools, as Nishida or Miki might argue. Rather, it involves a constant adjustment of one's relation to the world, a positioning of the self that encompasses both doing and undergoing. He writes, technology means self-adjustment in projection. The human function's effort to permeate the natural function, training in the complete exercise of human function, and overcoming the natural function for the sake of human unity. From psychological body, physiological body to psychological regulation, from social training to physical machines, all are included in human function. This structure is articulated even more clearly in his 1932 essay, 思想的機器における芸術並びにその動向. There, Nakai correlates the individual dimensions of slowness and projector with memory and imagination, and collective dimensions with record and planning. The elements that links individual and collective and mediates between slowness and projection at both levels is technology. Individual self-regulation corresponds to mind-body complex. Collective regulation corresponds to machines, organizations, and control. What Nakai emphasizes and what marks his position as distinctive is precisely the collective form of technology in this context. Even when he regards sports as a quintessential example of technical beauty, what he primarily has in mind are team-based or group competitions. For Nakai, the emergence of the collective is nothing other than a solely a modern phenomenon. In his view, even the problem of the subject, one of the central themes running through Western philosophy, has entered a new stage as the subject within a collective. Of course, Nakai is fully aware that machinization brings about a crisis of civilization and that rise of a collective results in massification of human being. And yet, as mentioned earlier, it is precisely on the top of his recognition that Nakai places great expectations upon the tendencies of the age. One could say that this kind of optimism toward technology forms the very foundation of Nakai's aesthetics. Nakai discovered hope in machination and collectivization inherent in technology because he sees in them the potential to fundamentally overturn the modern conception of art centered on genius, creation, and beauty. A conception which can all too easily lapse into self-indulgence, individualism, in authenticity. Moreover, for Nakai, this is not merely a hope or ideal. It is something already taking place in the form of what he called the collective organization of art, through film. Of course, Nakai is well aware that the art produced in this context is driven in the pursuit of profit. And yet, on that very basis, he speaks directly to those who disdain such emerging forms art. He writes, a segment of intellectual class, out of fear of modern beauty, often point to machines, jazz, and talkies, and then try to lament them as if they were nothing but an inevitable nuance. Yet beneath such lamentation lies a subtle and cruel repentance toward humanity, one they themselves will never, for all eternity, become aware of. They are lonely people who not only mistake systems for the masses, but even avert their gaze from love itself. Very difficult sentences. What's then? The nature of the beauty underlying the collective organized art. According to Naka, it is aesthetic sense of organization, 組織感の美観. The pleasure that arises when one's action within the group harmonizes precisely with the functioning of the whole. This, he says, represents the emerges a new inner sensibility. This idea clearly builds up Nakai's earlier concept of function. Just as well, coordinated muscle brings to joy the individual, the structural harmony of a social system can offer a similar joy to collective. It is easy to read totalitarian danger into this vision, and yet Nakai's words, where he understands the sense of organization as a sense of camaraderie found at limits, or life lived through the fullest, surely capture something of the lived reality of modern individuals who do not feel only suffering on a sorrow in being part of an organization. Nakai also says the following, quote, based on this sensibility, there may for the first time unfold, in color or in words, those tears or laughter which it seems no one in history has yet shed. The loneliness only felt by organization and organizational man, the way of smiling, known only to the organizational man. Yeah, sorry. Difficult sentences. Four, the shift in Nakai's understanding of technology and the theory of adumbration, the preceding discuss have clarified that for Nakai, the core of his philosophy of technology lies in the concept of mediation, beginning from Kant's technique of nature as a mediating structure between theory and practice, and incorporating in the bodily dimension into the concept of nature. Nakai reinterprets technology as a function of self-adjustment between activity and passivity. At the same time, he expands his analysis to the social realm, revealing the collective dimension of technology. In this sense, this theory of technology differs from the Kyoto school's mainstream view, which identifies production as the essential nature of technology. The theoretical foundation of Nakai's understanding is his appropriation of the concept of function, drawn from philosophy. To put it simply, the functionalist thinking defines the elements of a system in terms of their relational rules within a whole. Technology, in this framework, consists of identifying the most appropriate relational correspondence between parts and wholes. A sense of technical beauty arises when something is perceived as fitting smoothly into the structure. While this feeling of being well fitting, in Japanese, my own words, うまくはまっている, has potential dangers when considered in the context of totalitarianism. I will leave that critic aside for now. Instead, I wish to focus on more fundamental theoretical issue. How should the whole be conceived within the functionalist paradigm? In sports, for instance, where the number of participants is finite, it may be possible to define the whole in closed terms. However, in actual existence, any whole defined as a collection of functional elements is always simultaneously a part of some other larger whole. A window, though composed of functional elements like vegetation and lighting also, functions as a part of a larger whole that is a house. If the scope of a whole continually expands, how are we to understand its theoretical structure? In my view, there is no clear evidence in Nakai's text that he addressed this problem head on. Before Nakai, Tanabe, in his essay Theology, approached the systematic problem posed by critic of judgment from the standpoint of moral praxis. Later, in the paper included in Hegel's Philosophy and Dialectic, Tanabe would make clear that the universal, taken as the objective of reflective judgment, should be understood as an open totality that changes in accordance with the movement of its parts, and that, insofar as it remains something merely to be sought, it is to be conceived as nothingness. Nakai, who was involved in the additional work of Tetsugaku Kenkyu during this period, must have been well aware of Tanabe's argument in real time and in detail. Nevertheless, Nakai seems to have been somewhat restrained in entrusting this problem to the conceptual device of nothingness. While he does not appear to have directly examined the nature of such an open totality, what he does explore, closely tied to dynamic relationships between part and whole, is what considered one of the theoretical pillars of his philosophy, the theory of adambulation, or projection, in Japanese, shae. Nakai's theory of adambulation is most fully articulated in his short essay, 模写論の美学的関連, published in May 1934. However, before clarifying this theory in what follows, there is one major issue that must first be pointed out, an issue that is also decisive importance for understanding Nakai's philosophy of technology. It is that around this time, a shift appears to have occurred in Nakai's understanding of technology. That shift, in short, is a movement towards the production. For instance, in this essay, Nakai describes the general character of technology using a Marxist vocabulary. Quote, in general, the question of technology is considered as productive system related to the active element of human productive power, that is, labor power and the means of labor. Likewise, in the logic of committee, the logic of technology is introduced from the standpoint of the relation between labor power and the means of labor. Although this cannot be confirmed definitively, it seems likely that this period coincides with the time when, beginning with Tosaka, the Kyoto school began to address the problem of productive or creative theory of technology. It is possible that Nakai was drawn into the magnetic field of those discussions, I think. That does not mean, however, that the technology in his thought is entirely reducible to the problem of production, as is evident in the logic of committee, where Nakai proposes a logic of production in addition to logic of technology. So then, what does Nakai's theory of technology, shaped by its approach to the issue of product, mean? In order to answer this question, let us first clarify the nature of Nakai's theory of shae, adambulation. In Nakai's philosophy, adambulation refers to the way one thing is reflected or projected by another. This term itself was likely borrowed from Husserl's Abschattung, yet for Nakai, it does not refer to the mode in which an object appears to a consciousness. Rather, it describes a relationship in which some entity, including consciousness, is copied, mock-up, built by another entity. In Nakai's thought, in this relation of projecting and being projected, or copying, is not understood in terms of consciousness, but in terms of function. That is to say, what is at issue here is not how faithfully for the form of things reproduced, as would be discussed in the context of representation, but rather how something functions as a consistent element within that larger structure directed toward a specific purpose. In this sense, it refers to the way in which a part exists in a relation to correspondence with the whole. According to Nakai, adambulation takes on three forms, namely direct adambulation, 直接者へ反射、upper adambulation、上部者へ反射、and fundamental adambulation、copying、or projecting、人者へ、あるいは模写。The first type of adambulation is a direct action or reflex movement that occurs without the intervention of reflective activity. This form plays a little role in Nakai's overall discussion. What is important is the relationships between the second and third forms of adambulation. With regard to third type, a fundamental adambulation is also called orthographic adambulation, Seishae, Nakai writes. This is an ultimate potential state in which one adambulates and grasps one's own situation in a depth that recognition cannot reach. It is a limit of possible adambulations of the entire world series held by what is called the adambulative mechanism of consciousness. In other words, it refers a state in which something corresponds to and functions properly within a completely formed totality, where it is, in that sense, correctly adambulated by the whole. As Nakai put it elsewhere, to run without distortion, in other words, to fall into a correct form of running, is to attain orthographic adambulation of that running style. Orthographic adambulation then is a condition of being placed in the most appropriate function of position. But since this is only possible within the fully realized totality, it must be understood an ideal limit state. In contrast, the second form, upper adambulation, is the form of adambulation that appears distorted when compared to hypotheoretically assumed structure of orthographic adambulation. But it is precisely this upper adambulation in some distorted state that characterizes our actual condition. Skip these sentences. I will move to last chapter, chapter 5, technology as self-negating mediation. Building upon the theory of adambulation elaborated above, I now turn to examine how Nakai conceptualizes technology in his essays, two essays, particularly as he moves closer to the issue of production. In doing so, I aim to clarify the meaning of Nakai's concept of technology in its relationship to creative production. Nakai characterizes technology as follows. This is long sentences, but I need to read. The flow of water is a natural sequence, a law of nature. In order for this sequence to be transformed into human order, that is, into movement of electric machinery, an infinite conversion of sequences is required. But what is essential is that elements of the natural sequence are connected to human order, the emergence of a new necessary order within technological order. Those two rationalities, natural and human, are fundamentally different. The new viewpoint that links these distinct rationalities, that is the meaning of technology as mediation. For Nakai, human purposes create new orders through the manipulation of natural sequences, resulting in technological objects. However, this does not define the essence of technology itself. Technology resides in the point of, in the very connection, the mediation between natural and human sequences. Nevertheless, insofar as this mediation brings about new orders, it may also be considered a form of creation or production. In fact, Nakai characterizes moments in which reality and unreality are transformed through technology as instances of technical time, contrasting with natural time. These are marked by what he calls primordial productive presentness. 現生産的時間性。ちょっと茎みたい。茎というか、道だというか、茎というか、不思議な用語なんですけれども。Such primordial productive moments are, according to Nakai, distortions brought about by human purposive action. Technology constantly bends the order of nature, interfering with us, with its course. As a result, when something is brought into being or negated through technological intervention, it becomes increasingly likely to deviate from the mode of fundamental adambulation. Nakai writes, the technology causes human beings' original desires to be wounded and distorted to the point where even fundamental adumbration of human action, what it is that one truly desires, becomes obscured. In the logic of the committee, these aspects are treated separately under what Nakai calls the logic of production, which he presents as expressing the self-alienating aspect of technology, 技術の自己阻害的形態。Such moment arise through the distortion brought about human purposive action. That is, technology inevitably bends and disrupts the natural order. But this distortion also opens the possibility of creating new orders. Nakai warns that through this process, the original desires of human beings may become distorted and lost. Human desires are wounded and wrapped by technology to the point where even fundamental projection of human action, what one truly wants, can no longer discern. In the logic of committee, this is treated as alienating of aspect of technology, which Nakai calls the logic of production. However, the fact that technology brings about distortion must at the same time be understood as the emergence of a new necessary order. If that is the case, then the functional value and position of what exists should be determined within the newly generated order. And what is called a distortion must in fact be something defined in relation to this newly emerged framework. Here, Nakai's view becomes evident that only within the primordial productive presentness of technology can fundamental adumbration or orthographic adumbration be achieved. In other words, Nakai's theory of adumbration is grounded in theory of time. Earlier, we encountered his remarks that to fall into the correct form of running is to attain the orthographic adumbration, that running style. And we can now understand that this sense of falling into place is discussed further in his essay, Structure of Rhythm, where it's developed in the terms of concept of ma, that is momentary interval, that structures rhythm itself. We think along these lines, then the possible nature of a functionalist concept of totality in Nakai's thought begins to take shape. For Nakai, fundamental adumbration had previously referred to an ideal limit state, a condition in which one is projected in relation to entirety of the cosmos. But it becomes increasingly clear that such totality can no longer be considered fixed. This is because insofar as technology constantly brings forth new orders, the very structure that determines whether something is seen as fitting into place must itself be understood as changing along with it. Nakai frequently invoked the example of deviable balloon. I forgot the original Japanese. Once fictitious, unrealistic concept, but rendered real through the advent of the Zeppelin airship. If we are allowed to extend this example, then it would not be inappropriate to say that technology alters not only the things judged to function well, but the very framework by which such judgments are made. However, as far as the present, as far as I can determine, such conception of a moving fundamental adumbration is not clearly articulated in Nakai's text. Even so, it is unmistakably the case that the part, as it corresponds to totality, is understood in terms of dynamic structural relation. It is precisely here that core of Nakai concept of technology as mediation resides. Nakai understands the mode of existence brought about the order of technology as something experimental. That is to say, something that is deemed to fit within a given order at one moment is, in the very next moment, subjected to new technological purposiveness, becoming a kind of touchstone, or in some cases, a mere stepping stone for the generation of a new order. Nakai points out that at the foundation of the concept of function lies a purposive fidelity that is convertibility. He illustrates that this ever-changing nature of technology by referring to the example of the motion, explaining that technological existence is something that loses its very substantiality by coming into being, negate itself, and immediately become the mediation through which new technological purposes are indicated. The moment something comes into existence, its reality is denied. It appears as a distortion in relation to a newly emergent order. However, as the system searches for ways in which that distortion might come to fit within this new framework, the signs of yet another new order begin to emerge. In this sense, for Nakai, technology is not merely mediation between the natural order and the human order. Rather, it is a self-negating mediation, a form of mediation that, in mediating, negates itself. This is my argument. Next sentence or next paragraph is my only just addition. Thank you for listening.
So we can start with questions or comments and Jim.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Really interesting. Nice to see you again.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the idea of history behind Nakai's project. It seems to be a kind of monochrome, or at least a single line of development towards a totality. A totality that's fragile, it's open to distortion, but it's always a goal. So when you speak of the Soshikan no Bikan, I understand that a group coalesces, becomes a group, and that's a positive feeling. But the fact is, there's a plurality of frameworks, a plurality of orders, plurality of groups. Now, it seems to me the same problem, it comes up here that comes up with Watsuji. Namely, Watsuji denied individual conscience. All conscience that disagrees with the system is collective conscience, some form. And the fulfillment of humanness is denying the freedom of individual conscience. One of the most controversial parts of his thinking. But the fact is, there's a plurality of consciences or social orders. So what are the checks and the limitations of this? How do you stop it from this Soshikan from oppressing those who are outside the Soshiki or those who belong to a different Soshiki? This produces a kind of beauty, Soshiki no Bikan, but what if the beauty is defined as wealth and power, built on the blood of those who are marginalized from society? So the idea of beauty itself is ambiguous. But behind it all, I think, to go back to my first comment, is the idea that history is kind of uniform, and there's a totality, and it breaks down and picks itself up, it carries on, it goes distorted. In fact, even within a given culture like Japan, there's a plurality of totalities and soshi that disagree with each other. And maybe you could say a word about this idea of history.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for question and comment. In my view, particularly in the article of Inkai no Ronri, he separates the logic of technology from the logic of production. In the in-kind only, he tries to relate the logic of technology to instance or present, like Nishida says, time is the essence of time lies in no ima, vertical phase. And in contrast, the logic of production creates history. In Nakai's views, production and aims to increase the profit, and it is oriented to reproduction. Reproduction itself become the purpose when the reproduction is when the reproduction becomes the purpose itself. He thinks that histories emerge. In Japanese, suihei. Vertical is technology, and design history. This is my answer, and you said, I think the組織の美観、the 組織間の美観、this is a big problem for me, and I think Nakai presupposes that the organization is closed when we think. Sorry.
日本語でもいいですね。
日本語でもいいですか。sorry. いや、組織を、なんていうんですかね、閉じた組織っていうのを中井は想定してるように見える。そういう問題をはらむように見える。その一定の組織の中でうまくはまってるっていうことが、一つのなんていうか、美観をもたらすっていうのは、その人間が複数の組織に属していたりとか、あるいは組織に属していないっていうことをどういうふうに捉えきれるのかっていう問題は出てくるので、中井においては要するに全体性っていう問題が常に彼のこの機能主義的な発想では全体性っていうものの理論的な意味っていうのが、問われざるを得ないことになるかなっていうふうに、僕は思っています。はい。すみません。はい。
So I think my question is connected to this question of, I guess, what Professor Heisig kind of articulated in terms of the threat of totalitarianism. Now, you've emphasized this kind of primordial productive present. Nakai talks about the ima, the now, as this space for the production of historical novelty, something outside what is kind of routine historical formativity. Do you find anything like that? And you kind of end on logic of the committee, but that seems to be a very different logic than having the present as the site of primordial productivity. Do you find anything, when you connect these, do you find any kind of connection there between this early this kind of theory of projection and this theory of the now and the primordial productive present, and Inkai no Ronri, which kind of doesn't really have that as far as I can tell. So one more time.
It doesn't have what? I'm sorry.
It doesn't have this present as the site in which you kind of inject historical novelty. It's the recursivity of the logic of the committee that allows for the generation of novelty, not this kind of fecund, this really primordial loaded present. And is this like a change in later Nakai that you would say, or?
I think Nakai continues to think the primordial productive eternity is important. This is his continuous standpoint, I think. At least from the article of the logic of committee. Yeah. It is okay.
先生。
ありがとうございました。もう一度私はこの中井について全く知らないので、非常に基礎的な質問だと思うんですが、さっきのこの愛先生の裁判にちょっとつながると思うんですが、この委員会の論理基準、タイトル自体非常に面白くて、
はい
あるいは組織間の理解ですか、この委員会の論理を書いたら、非常に具体的な歴史的な背景とか、きっかけとかがあったんですか、あるいはこの彼の非常に抽象的な全体の施策の中で、そういうことが自然に浮かんだのか、あるいは何かのこの具体的な社会的な歴史的な背景があって、それに対応する形で、ああいう論理を展開したのか。なぜかというと、どうもその中井の思想の中には、全体性とか、いうことがあんまりにも多くて、例えば個人の何か独特性とか、個性とか、大体美観とか美学を言うときには、それが普通バランスとは言えないけど、出るのが普通かなと思うんですけども、何に答えるために彼はその委員会論理ということを展開したのか、ちょっと教えていただければと思います。
はい、ありがとうございます。ちょっとすみません。はい。ちょっと鼻水がついたので、ちょっと、お見苦しい申し訳ないです。そうですね。いろいろ、すみません、日本語でなんですけれども、いくつか文脈があると思うんですけれども、中井はですね、美学的な論文も1930年代前後に書くんですけれども、同時に言語論ということに興味を持っているので、別の言葉で言うと論理の問題を中井は考えているっていう文脈があるので、一つは論理っていうのを考える。しかもその論理っていうのは、ある種の、独白ではなくて、つまり、論理を表明するっていうことは、誰かに承認されるっていうことを求める。だから論理の本質の中には、誰かに向けて語られてるっていうことが含まれてるはずだっていう、その発想を中井は展開しようとしてるっていうことがある。つまりある種郷土学科の論理っていうのが、独白的な、モノログ的な論理であるとすれば、論理の根っこのところにはそもそも誰かに向けて語られてるっていう、その意味が含まれているから、それを展開するっていう意図があったと思います。それはおそらく、彼の周りにいた西田とか田辺的な論理っていうものを、今の言葉で言うとコミュニケーション的な論理へと展開させようっていう文脈があったと思います。あともう一つは、そうですね、技術っていう、今回の話で、見ますと、中井自身は、個人、要するに中井にとって技術っていうのは、受動性と、能動性の場面をうまく、調整する、テクニックなんですけれども、そのテクニックは同時に集団のテクニックとして見られているので、同時にテクノロジーだと思うんですが、その集団的なテクニックっていうものがどこで現実化されるのかっていうと、それは委員会とか組織だっていう話を中井はするので、だから技術論の展開という側面から も、委員会の論理っていう発想は、特徴づけられるかなと思います。
Question?
No. Just a very short question. 判断をください。ですね、実はですね、翻訳の問題ですね。先ほどは金先生と林先生に絡んでいる話だと思いますけれども、ですね、ロス先生がですね、委員会の論理を英語で訳したんですね。The logic of the committee と訳したんですよね。私はですね、La logique des comités と訳したんですよね。デコミテはですね、いろいろな委員会があるっていう。どう、日本人の皆さんは、それを、その委員会の論理はですね、どう解釈すればいいのでしょうか。一般的に言えば、あるいは、いろいろな成果。
そうです。日本語の語感を見る限り、あんまり委員会、委員会一般みたいな話、委員会とは何かっていう委員会の本質に向けて語られているので、もちろんそれは複数の委員会のあり方を排除しない論理になり得るとは思うんですけれども、そうですね。関数形で、無関詞で訳される方が、いいのかなと、個人的には、思います。はい。
I wonder if it depends, like, because committee is, in French you don't have this distinction, but the other word would be council, right? So one of the ways of thinking about Nakai's shift to the logic of the committee is in connection with this historical movement towards council communism, which has been speculated. And so there's this question of on what level should the council and council communism unfold? And if you think of like Karl Kautsky, Anton Pennacock, Rosa Luxemburg, they're kind of all in debates over what level like should this replace the state function, or should these be kind of local committees or local councils that report back up to the state function? I think the answer depends on how you think Nakai interprets council communism, which my sense is he's more of like a conservative. He would be more like the Kautsky vein, where he supports parliamentarism, and the council would be something on a local level. So my tendency, based on this kind of historical understanding, would be the plural, like councils, committees.
Because if you go to this, to the one committee that is the abstract version of committee, then you go back to what Professor Heise was saying before, that you will have one committee getting another committee, big committee, and then you have the nation. And it goes into a kind of totalitarian version of the committee. Though I have the feeling that when you look at the context and you look at how he was conceiving what a committee is, it's at a much smaller level. And at least it's how he has been interpreted after the war by people like Tsurumi and Kuno and so on.
Does it have to go that? I feel like when he talks about it, it's happening at multiple scales. On the one hand, because those expressions, I think, like you're saying, are really quite different from one another. And to me, there's always an ambivalence. On the one hand, it can be, oh, you're just talking about community at some level, or kind of like nation state kind of thing. But that doesn't feel like it's an inevitable factor. And partly, I think it can be read within any given unit, single unit, individual, kosei, anything like that we want to say that there's already that element at work within it. So I guess I definitely understand the idea, the threat of a totalitarianism that would be posed by that kind of logic if we take it as a totality, as the only totality, something like that. But
at the end of the logic of the committee, I didn't fully understand the question, but Nakai seems to insist that this process is an infinite schematizing. So I'm actually, my paper going to argue precisely the opposite of what I'm hearing, is that for me, Nakai builds into the logic of the committee a process that constantly takes it beyond itself. It cannot ever stabilize itself. It's constantly moving out. It has openness built right into it. And there's that infinite schematism at that end, right towards the end. So I think the unity is important, but I think you want a unity that's always a non-dual duality, that's always open.
That's one. Yeah, actually. So I do agree with you, but it's a question of phrasing and wording, because very quickly when you talk about Nakai in general, people who don't know his work, you will have comments saying that he tried to figure out something like what's he precisely.
I'm really worried by this conclusion that you come to. I think of Mary Davy and Ivan Illich, who basically took the same stance on institutions, which is the problem with, you call it a committee or call it an institution, sochiki in Japanese, seigo, is that they develop to a certain point when they begin to work for the exact opposite purpose for which they were founded. And they develop precisely in the way you're talking about. They meet conflicts, they adjust to changing situations, they grow bigger and bigger and bigger. So the education goes down as schooling gets more expensive and better. Health in the nation goes down as our hospitals get more sophisticated and so forth. Energy equity goes down as the companies that produce it get bigger and bigger. So I think, I'm not saying that was, what I'm talking about is Nakai's idea, but I think that idea itself is a dangerous one. That an institution is capable of correcting itself. Technology made a mess of the planet. We've turned our lakes into garbage heaps, and so, but technology will fix it.
I don't think that's not what I was saying. I don't.
No, it's not what you were saying. I mean, he's making. Nakai is making precisely this point, and he's saying that we have no choice. We have to react against big companies, big organization, big institution, and the only way is to be better. And he takes the example of UNESCO. Is that how you say in English? UNESCO, and UNESCO would be the possible reaction, and only for him, the only kind of reaction, because you can't fight against evil organization with little tools. He probably was wrong.
I think so, yeah.
But it's
but in any case, things no one was.
Sorry, I think like if we think, because Nakai he died in the early 1950s, right? So I think for that time it makes sense.
It makes sense. It makes sense.
Yeah.
And UNESCO,
Or the library,
or the library,
where he wound up.
or National Library.
Okay, thank you. I think we must move to the last speaker or cancel it. So it depends. If we want to listen Kelly's talk, we have to start now. So thank you very much, Professor.